Hello everyone, welcome. I'd like to quickly explain what I'm trying to do with this channel. Basically, I realize that although there are a lot of really good philosophy video essay channels, there are relatively fewer ones for psychology, especially about more complex topics. So I'm going to try and present interesting psychological ideas in an accessible way, starting off with the work of Erich Fromm, specifically his theories about isolation, freedom, and fascism. To do this, we'll have a look at ideas from three of his most important works: Escape and Freedom, and The Art of Loving, and The Sane Society. And to motivate the points I'd like to make, I'll first show you two quotes, one from Fromm and another from Dostoevsky. So the first quote is from The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I don't really have time to go into the plot or the context of this specific quote, but the quote is, "Nothing has ever been more insupportable for a man in human society than freedom. In the end, they will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, 'Make us your slaves, but feed us.'" And here the key idea is kind of being the inherent conflict that comes with freedom psychologically, and in the case of Dostoevsky, spiritually. And then the second quote is from Fromm himself, and he says, "The danger of the past was that men became slaves. The danger of the future is that men may become robots." But before we can dig more into the ideas that I'm trying to motivate, first let's talk a little bit about Fromm himself. He was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1900 and died in 1980, and he was a highly influential social psychologist and psychodynamic theorist, as well as a cultural critic and a democratic socialist. There is a lot of important context to understand Fromm's ideas, both historically, personally, and intellectually, so I'm going to try and do my best to um, succinctly describe that right now. Okay, so we'll start off chronologically. One of Fromm's largest influences was German philosopher Karl Marx, a man who needs no introduction. One of Marx's major contributions to philosophy was his theory of alienation in capitalist society. To put it briefly, Marx believed that due to the labor organization within capitalism, people become alienated from their own labor. Instead of working for their own ends, they work to abstract ends of which they do not necessarily directly reap the benefits, such as the accumulation of capital. And Fromm sought to look further into the psychological conditions of this alienation, as will be described further soon. The philosophical movement of existentialism was also a major influence on Fromm. Two thinkers that he makes explicit references to in his books are Friedrich Nietzsche and Fyodor Dostoevsky. And due to the influence of these thinkers, Fromm explored the ideas about freedom, self-actualization, and finding meaning in the face of suffering and isolation. Fromm's other main influence was Sigmund Freud, a man who, like Marx, needs no introduction. The two main ideas that Fromm borrows from Freud are that one, psychological problems can originate due to the conflict between irreconcilable drives or the inability to meet a drive due to social conditions that inhibit doing so, and two, that a large source of trauma comes from childhood experience. However, we'll see that Fromm focused on different drives than Freud and thought that different traumatic experiences were the root issue. Where Freud thought the issue was sexuality, Fromm took a different route. Finally, the political and historical events of the early 20th century in Germany were Fromm's real call to action. Before the Nazis took power, Fromm joined the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which is a collection of German leftist intellectuals such as Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, who were trying to criticize Marx's ideas about socialism and communism following inevitably from the failures of capitalism. They saw that the world was tending in the opposite direction towards fascism, and thought that although socialism might not be the inevitable consequence of capitalism, to them they viewed it as still desirable, so they wanted to figure out what conditions might be able to bring it about. They did this through a rigorous philosophical critique of culture and mass media, the negative consequences of the Enlightenment, and in the case of Fromm, the psychological consequences of capitalist society. However, the ability of these thinkers to do their work was quickly threatened by the rise of Nazism in Germany. Fromm, who was a Jew as well as a leftist intellectual, was a prime political target by Hitler's authoritarian regime and was forced to flee to the United States with other members of the Frankfurt School. The fear he experienced in his home country of falling prey to the Nazi ideology influenced Fromm to focus on the psychological conditions that give rise to authoritarianism, and specifically fascism. And just as a note, I have massively oversimplified the history of the Frankfurt School, so if you would like to learn more, I would like to encourage you to do so because it's very interesting. Check out the link in the bio for a great video about it. But for the meanwhile, we will have to move on to the content of Fromm's ideas in Escape from Freedom. I've opted to quote Fromm at length many times to support the points that I wish to explain, and I will do this with the hope that you may get the deepest insight into his thought and not be biased by my interpretation of his work. Okay, so we'll start off with a quote. Fromm says, "What is essential in the existence of man is the fact that he has emerged from the animal kingdom, from instinctive adaptation, that he has transcended nature, although he never leaves it. He is a part of it, and yet once torn away from nature, he cannot return to it. When man is born, the human race as well as the individual, he is thrown out of a situation which was definite as the instincts, into a situation which is indefinite, uncertain, and open. There is certainty only about the past, and only about the future as far as that is death. This awareness of himself as a separate entity, the awareness of his own short lifespan, of the fact that without his will he is born, and against his will he will die, that he will die before those whom he loves, or they before him, the awareness of his aloneness and separateness, of his helplessness before the force of nature and of society, all this makes his separate, disunited existence an unbearable prison. He would become insane could he not liberate himself from this prison and reach out, unite himself in some form or other with men, with the world outside. The deepest need of man, then, is the need to overcome his separateness, to leave the prison of his aloneness. Man, of all ages and cultures, is confronted with the solution of one and the same question, the question of how to overcome separateness, how to achieve union, how to transcend one's own individual life, and to find at-one-ment." And that is from The Escape to Freedom, published in 1956, pages 7 through 9. To summarize, Fromm thought that the development of our ego came with the destruction of our previous subjective mental state, which was semi-conscious, fragmentary, egoless, and in which there was no conscious differentiation between subject and object. Replacing that is a discontinuous and isolated separate existence. This separate existence and the sense of vulnerability to both the forces of nature and society that our consciousness of it leads to is a source of great fear and anxiety. Fromm thinks that we are all forced to alleviate this anxiety in one way or another, and we are faced with the task of living up to our freedom and spontaneously realizing our own individuality and creative will, or else we will cower away and try to escape our freedom in pathological ways which destroy the integrity and autonomy of our own individuality. To quote Fromm again, "Each new step into his new human existence is frightening. It always means to give up a secure state which is relatively unknown for one which is new, which one has not yet mastered. Undoubtedly, if the infant could think at the moment of the severance of the umbilical cord, he would experience the fear of dying. A loving fate protects us from this first panic, but at any new step, at any new stage of our birth, we are afraid again. We are never free from two conflicting tendencies: one to emerge from the womb, from the animal form of existence into a more human existence, from bondage to freedom; another, to return to the womb, to return to nature, to certainty and security." To explain his ideas, Fromm differentiated between negative and positive freedom. Negative freedom is highlighted by a lack of external authority preventing you from the possibility of doing something, whereas positive freedom is having the means to actually do the things you want to do. Fromm believed that industrial capitalist society and the Enlightenment provided many people with negative freedoms, but not the positive freedoms to act on them, and that this lag between negative and positive freedom exacerbated the innate conflict between comfort and spontaneity. And it was this conflict between comfort and spontaneity that Fromm thought was the motivating factor behind people trying to escape the burden of their freedom and to not fully self-actualize. Fromm gave some examples of what he called the mechanisms of escape, that is, the different things that people do to alleviate themselves from the anxiety caused by their isolation and vulnerability. Firstly, he mentions what he calls moral masochism, which is any act that subverts the integrity and autonomy of our individuality. One example of this is during a codependent relationship. Fromm thought that whether or not you were the partner who makes the other dependent to you, or the one who's themselves dependent, ultimately both individuals are looking to flee their own individuality. The one by giving up their freedom and following their partner's course of will, and the other by trying to expand his concept of self to include their partner as a sort of personality crutch. And two quick more quotes from Fromm. "To the extent to which an individual is potent, that is, able to realize his potential on the basis of his freedom and integrity of self, he does not need to dominate and is thus lacking in the lust for power." And the other one, "It is the desperate attempt to gain secondary strength where genuine strength is lacking." Another example of what Fromm called moral masochism can be found in people who ascribe to authoritarian political ideologies or cults. Beyond this, Fromm thought that people try to escape their freedom by destroying what threatened them, that is, what made them conscious of their isolation and perceived feelings of inferiority. They may also evolve into egomania as a compensation for perceived feelings of inferiority, or withdraw from the world by destroying their individuality completely, either through suicide or psychosis. However, the mechanism of escape that Fromm feared the most was that people might become what he called automations. I will discuss this last concept as well as the positive alternative that Fromm identified further soon, after I discuss relevant components of Fromm's critique of Western society and ideology. It is also worth mentioning so far that some of Fromm's ideas about codependent relationships do tend to victim blame, and in that light, do deserve reevaluation. But real quick, just one last quote for this section to summarize what has been said thus far. Once the primary bonds which gave security to the individual are severed, once the individual faces the world outside as a completely separate entity, two courses are open to him since he has to overcome the unbearable state of powerlessness and aloneness. By one course, he can progress to positive freedom. He can relate himself spontaneously to the world in love and work, in the genuine expression of his emotional, sensuous, and intellectual capacities. He can thus become one again with man, nature, and himself without giving up the independence and integrity of his individual self. The other course open to him is to fall back, to give up his freedom, and to try to overcome his aloneness by eliminating the gap that has arisen between his individual self and the world. The second course never reunites him with the world in the way he was related to it before he emerged as an individual, for the fact of his separateness cannot be reversed. It is an escape from an unbearable situation which would make life impossible if it were prolonged. This course of escape, therefore, is characterized by its compulsive character, like every escape from a threatening panic. It is also characterized by the more or less complete surrender of individuality and the integrity of the self. Thus, it is not a solution which leads to happiness and positive freedom. It is, in principle, a solution which is to be found in all neurotic phenomena. It avoids an unbearable anxiety and makes life possible by avoiding panic. It does not solve the underlying problem and is paid for by a kind of life that often consists of only automatic or compulsive activities. As I mentioned earlier, Fromm was a democratic socialist and staunch cultural critic, so he is very antagonistic to Western capitalist society. That being said, not all of the issues he identified apply solely to Western society, even if they're most prominent in it. And some of the critiques he made apply to complex social organization in and of itself, regardless of which society you're looking at. And firstly, he stressed that behind the free and democratic forms of Western society, there's a coercive hidden authoritarianism. This is an authoritarianism of conformity, and Fromm believed it was the source of much of our misery. And this is quite similar to some of the work of French philosopher Michel Foucault. So if you want to look more into his concept of normalizing power, I would check out his book, Discipline and Punish. But here's another quote by Fromm talking about conformity. He says, by conforming with the expectations of others, by not being different, these doubts about one's own identity are silenced and a certain security is gained. However, the price paid is high. Giving up spontaneity and individuality results in the thwarting of life. Psychologically, the automation, while being alive biologically, is dead emotionally and mentally. While he goes through the motions of living, his life runs through his hands like sand. Behind a front of satisfaction and optimism, modern man is deeply unhappy. As a matter of fact, he's on the verge of desperation. The second critique he levied at Western society is that its coercive, conformist socialization alienates us from our spontaneous creative will and breeds a sense of inferiority. He says, the inability to act spontaneously, to express what one genuinely feels and thinks, and the resulting necessity to present a pseudo-self to others and oneself are the root of the feeling of inferiority and weakness. Whether or not we are aware of it, there is nothing of which we are more ashamed than of not being ourselves, and there is nothing that gives us greater pride and happiness than to think, to feel, and to say what is ours. Beyond this, Fromm thought that we lived in a constant anxiety due to a failure to meet the wants that are being pushed on us from the outside. He says, a great number of our decisions are not really our own, but are suggested to us from the outside. We have succeeded in persuading ourselves that it is we who have made the decision, whereas we have actually confirmed with the expectations of others, driven by the fear of isolation and by more direct threats to our life, freedom, and comfort. Modern man lives under the illusion that he really knows what he wants, while he actually wants what he is supposed to want. He also critiqued the materialist focus of capitalist society and how it focused on the end product has made us fail to appreciate part of the productive process that is the most fulfilling and meaningful, namely the act of creativity, for it is through creativity that we realize our individuality and spontaneity. He says, what matters is the activity as such, the process, and not the result. In our culture, the emphasis is just the reverse. We produce not for a concrete satisfaction, but for the abstract purpose of selling our own commodity. We feel that we can acquire everything material or immaterial by buying it, and thus things become ours independently of any creative effort of our own in relation to them. In the same way, we regard our personal qualities and the results of our efforts as commodities that can be sold for money, prestige, and power. The emphasis this shifts from the present satisfaction of creative activity to the value of the finished product. Thereby, man missed the only satisfaction that can give him real happiness, the experience of the activity of the present moment, and chases it after a phantom that leaves him disappointed as soon as he believes he has caught it, the illusory happiness called success. He continues in a different quote. What kind of men, then, does our society need? What is the social character suited to 20th century capitalism? It needs men who cooperate smoothly in large groups, who want to consume more and more, and whose tasks are standardized and can easily be influenced and anticipated. It needs men who feel free and independent, not subjected to any authority or principle or conscience, yet willing to be commanded, to do what is expected, to fit into the social machine without friction. It is also worth noting that a lot of the language Fromm uses is only in masculine gender pronouns, so that is also something worth taking into account. He is in many ways a product of his time in that sense. Finally, Fromm distinguished genuine, spontaneous thoughts and feelings from what he called pseudo thoughts and pseudo feelings. These are essentially borrowed opinions and feelings from the culture used to patch up repressed feelings and ideas that are painful to us. We cover up the areas of our life where it is unlived and empty by hiding those feelings with pseudo feelings. Another important idea in Fromm, which shows clearly his influence by Marx, is that of ideology. For Marx, ideology is a system of beliefs that are made to legitimize the power of the social system, whether that be capitalist or feudal, or going back even further. But for Fromm, he takes a more psychological approach. So he thought that the material and social conditions in a society give rise to certain psychological complexes and force people to compensate for drives not met. Any ideology could become successful on the basis of appealing to those specific needs and complexes in a set society. So for Fromm, people's readiness to adopt fascism was a direct result of the methods of social organization brought about by capitalism. He thought that capitalism in modern industrial society made people feel alienated, belittled, and powerless, and fascism emphasizes ideas like the insignificance of the individual relative to the collective social body, or the unchangeable will of fate. Due to the congruence between the inner psychological state and the tenets of fascism, fascism was able to take hold. And Fromm thought that fascism was partly seductive and powerful because it allows people to at once submit to a greater authority and thus have complete comfort, all the while themselves feeling superior and dominant over another social group. In the case of Nazi Germany, the leader was Hitler, and the target social groups were Jews, members of the LGBTQ+ community, left-wing intellectuals, and other non-Aryan ethnic minorities. To quote Fromm, people do not die quietly from physical starvation. They do not die quietly from psychic starvation either. If we look only at the economic needs as far as a normal person is concerned, if we do not see the unconscious suffering of the average atomized person, then we fail to see the danger that threatens our culture from its human basis, the readiness to accept any ideology and any leader if only he promises excitement and offers a lot of structure and symbols which allegedly give meaning and order to an individual's life. The despair of the human automation is fertile soil for the political purposes of fascism. Just as much as Fromm was a social critic, he was interested in individual solutions. And what Fromm feared was that capitalist society was turning people into automations. That is, into people with no genuine thoughts or feelings of their own, with no connection to the world, with, in place of that, the simulated experiences of pop culture and capitalist ideology, replacing romantic love with sappy love songs and real creative achievement with the status of a cog in the machine. He thought that it was automations, those with the least ability to develop senses of self and spontaneously realize their creative will, that would inevitably fall prey to the false promises of security and prosperity of fascism, either through complicitness or passiveness. Another psychological type that Fromm described was the authoritarian character. Whereas the automations are the passive types who haven't formed a strong enough individuality to resist authoritarianism, the authoritarian characters are the active proponents of authoritarianism. They love authority, both to subject themselves to it and to try and exert it over those they perceive as weaker than themselves. Fromm said, "The feature common to all authoritarian thinking is the conviction that life is determined by forces outside of man's own self, his interests, his wishes. The only possible happiness lies in the submission to these forces." A third type was the neurotic. This is someone who has tried to resist the conformity of Western culture and maintain their individuality, but was not able to do so completely. Although not in automation, they are not successful cases either, because they suffer from the symptoms of an inability to be fully independent. Fromm said, "Most psychiatrists take the structure of their own society so much for granted that to them the person who is not well adapted assumes the stigma of being less valuable. On the other hand, the well adapted person is supposed to be the more valuable person in terms of the scale of human values. If we differentiate two concepts of normal and neurotic, we come to the following conclusion. The person who is normal in terms of being well adapted is often less healthy than the neurotic person in terms of human values. Often he is well adapted only at the expense of having given up his self in order to become more or less the person he believes he is expected to be. All genuine individuality and spontaneity may have been lost. On the other hand, the neurotic person can be characterized as someone who is not ready to surrender completely in the battle for his self. To be sure, his attempt to save his individual self was not successful, and instead of expressing his self productively, sought salvation through neurotic symptoms and by withdrawing into a fantasy life. Nevertheless, from the standpoint of human values, he is less crippled than the kind of normal person who has lost his individuality altogether. Finally, there is what Fromm saw as the positive solution, the person who can positively connect to the world around them while maintaining their integrity and autonomy. This feat is accomplished by accepting oneself, being authentic to oneself and one's lived experiences, and working for one's own ends. To take responsibility for your life and the burden that entails, to see yourself as the ultimate product of your creation and the purpose of your life. To quote Fromm, "We believe that there is a positive answer, that the process of growing freedom does not constitute a vicious cycle, and that man can be free and yet not alone, critical and yet not filled with doubts, independent and yet an integral part of mankind. This freedom man can attain by the realization of his self, by being himself." In another quote, "The new security is dynamic. It is not based on protection, but on man's spontaneous activity. It is a security acquired each moment by man's spontaneous activity. It is a security that only freedom can give, that needs no illusions because it has eliminated those conditions that necessitate illusions." Another quote, "The whole life of the individual is nothing but the process of giving birth to himself. Indeed, we should be fully born when we die, although it is the tragic fate of most individuals to die before they are born." And again, it is worth noting another similarity to Foucault, who also conceptualized self-actualization as an aesthetic art. Foucault said, "What strikes me is the fact that in our society, art has become something which is related only to objects and not to individuals or to life. That art is something which is specialized or which is done by experts who are artists. But couldn't everyone's life become a work of art? Why should the lamp or the house be an art object, but not our life?" Although Fromm did focus on individual answers to the burden of our freedom, he was equally interested in social solutions. After all, he thought that many of the personal psychological failings were often enabled by the inability of society to provide people with the support to form their own individuality. This critique was primarily leveled at capitalism, which Fromm saw as a force that subjugated people to its own abstract ends of power instead of providing them the ability to exercise positive freedom. He said, "The problem we are confronted with today is that of the organization of social and economic forces so that man, as a member of organized society, can become the master of these forces and cease to be their slave." Another quote, "Only if man masters society and subordinates the economic machine to the purposes of human happiness, and only if he power actively participates in the social process, can he overcome what now drives him into despair, his aloneness and his feeling of powerlessness. Man does not suffer so much from poverty today as he suffers from the fact that he has become a cog in a large machine, an automation, that his life has become empty and lost its meaning. The victory over all kinds of authoritarian systems will be possible only if democracy does not retreat, but takes the offensive, and proceeds to realize what has been its aim in the minds of those who fought for freedom throughout the centuries. It will triumph over the forces of nihilism only if it can imbue people with a faith that is the strongest the human mind is capable of, the faith in life and in truth, and in freedom as the active and spontaneous realization of the self. Based on these criticisms, he developed his own conception of what he called the sane society. He thought that without access to the basic needs of life, such as food, water, shelter, healthcare, etc., people wouldn't have the opportunity to focus on the most important task in their lives, to create their personalities. So he advocated for a democratic social society in which people have control over their own labor and can therefore pursue their own spontaneous creative ends. And after all, if the goal of human social organization is to help people lead the most fulfilling lives possible, then he reasoned this is the sort of society that best helps people accomplish that goal. A lot has been said so far, so without restating everything, I will try to tie some things together and summarize its essential claims. Fromm thought that there is a conflict between the need for security and the need to pursue our own individuality and freedom. The social situation which we are placed in influences the extent to which we are faced with this crisis in two ways. Firstly, to the degree that the form of social organization makes people feel isolated and alienated, the crisis is exacerbated. Secondly, the options that a given society offers people to overcome this crisis are highly influential on the end results. Fromm feared that modern capitalist society is turning people into automations who have been prevented from knowing and developing themselves. Furthermore, he thought that these automations were the basis for the success of fascism, an ideology that is congruent with the inner psychological state produced by Western society, that is to say, one that emphasizes the powerlessness and meaninglessness of the individual. The only way to overcome this is for people to get in touch with their creative side and develop their personalities. Although achievable at the personal level, Fromm stressed that we must work together to build a society that democratizes the act of self-actualization, allowing the greatest amount of people to become what they could possibly be. And Fromm showed us the two options we are faced with: a totalitarian nightmare or a prospering society that encourages people to become themselves. The deciding factor of which route we'll take is whether or not we can, at the societal and individual level, become mature enough to handle the burden of our isolation and alienation. Our task is to overcome the trauma of our separateness and turn it into an act of creative expression and personal liberation. If you made it this far, I just want to thank you for watching. I decided not to include any of my own commentary about Fromm because there was already so much content in this video. I thought it was best to focus just on what he actually thought and not my response. But maybe in the future I will do that. I know I'm planning on doing a video on Jung sometime soon. Yeah, but thank you for watching. Have a nice day.